Good to see you guys. Glad we're joined up again to talk about what's going on in Washington. And as we usually do, we do these on a quarterly basis, and we like to start off with quick background. So why don't we each do our own little introduction? I am sort of a facilitator here. I contribute a little bit, but I like to just sort of facilitate interesting discussion. I'm Liz Powell. I'm the founder of G2G Consulting, which stands for Government to Growth. We are a government affairs firm based in Washington. And with that, we'd love to pass to Chris Campbell.
Hey guys, thanks everyone for joining again. Chris Campbell, I'm a chief strategist at a company called Kroll. It's a large financial services risk advisory firm. Before that was assistant secretary of Treasury, and before that was staff director of the Senate Finance Committee.
And I'm Chris Oates. I am a lecturer at Boston University. I have a political risk advisory company, and I also have a tech startup based around the policy space called Legislata. And my background is mainly on trying to forecast what's going to happen rather than actually making it happen, as Chris Campbell used to do, and still does make it happen.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. So there's a lot going on. What we'd like to do is to have a little discussion. As you folks are listening, if you have questions, just post them and we will answer the questions towards the end. So first off, big issue, debt ceiling. So I think we should start off with what is this debt ceiling issue? And then a little bit of context and history. And so for that, I would love to start with Chris Campbell.
Yeah, so it's a great, it's a very complicated question. It's very, very easy to confuse the debt ceiling with the typical budget process or the annual kind of keeping the government lights on process that happens every single year. The debt ceiling is a process that Congress created to effectively put a check on the administration, the executive branch, to limit how much money the government can bring on in debt. Congress inserted itself about 60 years ago to suggest that they had a seat at the table, and that the executive branch could not borrow debt. And they can only go so far, so they can only raise so much debt before having to come back to Congress to get more authority to raise more debt. So I can tackle this in many ways, but just so as quick as possible. So I typically try to level set this. The administration, the executive branch, are just irrespective of party, no matter what president's in power, the federal government usually spends anywhere between $1.3 and $1.5. So $1.30 to $1.50 for every dollar it brings in. So that we're constantly in a necessary position to having to borrow debt, both domestically and internationally, to keep our government working. The government, how much we keep our government lights on, and our folks paid, and potholes filled, and all those other things the government does. This is a necessary evil. And the pox is on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, for putting us into so much debt. The debt ceiling, the best way to think about it is kind of like, and I liken it to people in their everyday lives. It's effectively, the easiest way to think about this is your family's credit cards. These are things you buy. You put it on your credit card. So these are already purchases you've already made. At the end of the month, the bank's going to send you an invoice, effectively, and a bill, and you're going to have to pay that bill. Effectively, the debt ceiling is exactly the same thing. That the government has taken on obligations, and these are now looking backwards. We're having to pay those obligations or pay our debtors, typically interest or principal. Literally the exact same thing you do with a credit card at home. And the challenge, though, just like a credit card when you're at home and you don't pay that bill, the bank is going to take away your credit. So they're going to cancel your credit card. And if you go to another bank, or if you try to get more credit, you're going to pay extra for that privilege. So let's say you have pristine credit and you're at a 16% interest rate. If you don't pay your debt, that 16% is going to go to 24, 25, maybe 30%. It's exactly the same thing in the US government. So we've never had this challenge ever in the history of our country, but if perchance Secretary Yellen has given Congress a deadline of June, the end of June, by which the government will run out of money and not be able to pay its obligations and not pay the debt that we've incurred in the past. We've never what's now been called the X date. We've never breached that X date. But if we did, it's kind of a cascade of things that really kind of cascade of horribles that could happen after that. Really, no one really knows what happens because we've never done it. But all I can tell you is, as a former Treasury official that had to manage our debt, nation's debt, really anything past that deadline is really scary, and it's not something we really want to experience. But one of them would be to significantly have to pay a premium for people to buy our debt. When that happens, it means that mortgage rates, your auto rates, kind of anything, all debts, both personal and public, would go up significantly. With the cost of the borrowing would be significantly higher for all Americans, prohibitively more expensive. And so if we're already in an inflationary environment, which we are, it would be really almost catastrophically damaging for most American families. Not let alone the other issues, like, right now, the reason why we're able to have people buy our debt is because we're the reserve currency. That would put significant damage. We have countries like China and many others that really trying to move away from the US dollar as a dollar denominated debt. And this would give them a significant push to move away from the dollar reserves, which we don't want to do as the US. So, and then we can get to the process of how we got here. Liz, I don't know if you want to do this or not, but I can go ahead first and say, look, as a person who literally was in the negotiating seat for the last 12 I negotiated the last 12 debt limit increases, including the 2011 deal, which led to the first default downgrade of our debt in the US. We are in a really difficult posture. The president has, as presidents in the past, has refused to negotiate over the debt limit, but has a really extremely difficult House of Representatives, the makeup by which is rather unique in the process of this happened. Many people remember how difficult it was to get Speaker McCarthy elected as Speaker. It took a historic number of votes. These people, the members of Congress that elected Kevin as Speaker McCarthy as Speaker, these are people that I wouldn't question if they're willing to negotiate hard, right? So, and I think, and so we're now at a weird spot, and a kind of a really dangerous spot. And I don't want to scare everyone. I certainly don't want everyone to short the markets. But we're at a really interesting, now the 15th. We have about 15 days in order to meet the Secretary's deadline to get over the debt limit. And candidly, not to panic everyone, but procedurally speaking, in the Senate, the House, the scorekeepers, and kind of enrollment of the bill, we're almost at the deadline just for procedure, Senate procedure, House procedure to get something done. And we're literally not even at a place where we actually have an agreement. So, I mean, that would assume we have an agreement today that can be put into the legislative text, that then the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation can score. And then the House has to wait 3 days for it to vote. And there's about a 5-day process if it fully gets pulled out in the Senate. And so we're in a really extremely difficult spot where we may have to do a short-term extension. And just remind people, in 2011, when we came to this close to the deadline and did a short-term extension, we got an S&P downgrade of the US debt for the first time in the history of our country. So that's kind of where we're at. There is, just to very quickly bifurcate this with kind of when, and oftentimes happens now, is that the national, when Congress doesn't do its job and they don't pass the budget, the spending bills, and like the national parks close, that kind of stuff. This is so different. This is forever changing. This could be literally forever changing the way that the U.S. posture is on currency and on economics. but certainly would be deeply, deeply, deeply impactful to everyone listening, as their the cost of borrowing, their cost of credit cards and their homes and cars will be precipitously higher if Congress breaches this deadline.
That's really helpful context. So thank you for explaining all that. I'd love to get your take, Chris Oates, on the politics of this. Why is this seen as a political opportunity? What are the sort of the pros and cons of using this debt ceiling extension? Like, why is that an opportunity for Republicans? Like, what's the politics behind this?
Well, yeah. So I laughed inwardly when Chris Campbell said he'd been involved in negotiations, because this is not really a negotiation. It's a game of chicken. Because as he said, it makes no sense. It's not a negotiation, because a negotiation is, let's negotiate on this. And if we don't come to an agreement, this is my fallback option. So, we negotiate on whether I take a job. It's okay because I always have the option of not taking that job. But this is like, let's negotiate on whether we should blow ourselves up with dynamite. There's no, like, neither party is willing to back away. So really the negotiation is which side seems more willing to drive the country over the cliff. Because if Joe Biden says, I'm not going to negotiate, clean debt ceiling or nothing else, that I will sign a clean debt ceiling the second you give it to me, but nothing else, then the Republicans would either say, if it was a game of chicken, they would say, well, I think he's serious and I don't want to push us over the cliff, so we'll just send him a clean debt ceiling. We'll negotiate on the budget when the budget comes up. But what clearly has happened is the White House has calculated that if Biden says a clean debt ceiling or nothing else, some members of the Republican Party, and enough to in the House, and enough to prevent it from actually going through, are willing to drive the economy over the cliff to cause all this. And so that's why they're negotiating. It's like they're not backing down as much as they are conceding in the game of chicken and trying to do that. And that's why I think it's really hard to forecast, because Biden doesn't want to concede, because it makes him, from a political standpoint, it makes him look weak. And he doesn't want to necessarily enact the policy changes that will be enacted. And he doesn't want to set the precedent that we negotiated on the debt ceiling, because on the Democratic side of the aisle, they talk about it as taking a hostage. They don't talk about it as a usual negotiation. They talk about it as something extraordinary, not your usual to and fro of politics. So they don't want to do it, but they're so scared of the consequences of not doing it that they're willing to negotiate and have this, what they call the dual track of, they're not negotiating on the debt ceiling, they're negotiating on the budget that's coming up, but it just so happens to be at the same time as the debt ceiling. So they're able to say, we didn't negotiate on the debt ceiling, we negotiated on the budget, but it happened at the same time as the debt ceiling. So Kevin McCarthy can go to his caucus and say that we won on the debt ceiling. At least that seems to be what they're going for. And I saw President Biden said on Wednesday he's going to negotiate. Now, the thing about forecasting this is that there is some people think the get out of jail free cards, which is either, you might have heard it, mint the coin, which is basically say we're not issuing any debt, but we're going to mint $1 trillion coin and the Treasury can borrow against it, or invoking the 14th Amendment by saying that the debt ceiling from the very first time it was created was unconstitutional, because it meant that in the event of something like this, the president and the executive branch could not honor all the debts of the United States. And I think folks in the White House have looked at it, but they do seem to be reticent to do it. And whether that's because they don't know of the political consequences of that, or they don't know of the substantive consequences, whether that would go through. They don't know whether that would be seen as a default in effect, and so they want to avoid it at all costs, and they don't want to bring it up. It does seem to me to be a very odd negotiating strategy, which is like, we absolutely do not want the country to drive off the cliff. That would be catastrophic. It would be while we're the president, so it makes us look really bad. And the two things that we could do to unilaterally get out of that situation, we're not going to consider. So I think there's some consternation from the Democratic side that the White House seems to be taking this off the table. And that's why I think the politics, if we do get down to it, and it does become an option of either we go past the X date and there's all the awful financial catastrophes, or President Biden says, we really tried, they weren't negotiating good in faith, we're invoking the 14th Amendment. If Kevin McCarthy wants to sue us to try to cause us to default and goes up to the Supreme Court, I'm happy for them to do that. But I'm going to invoke the 14th Amendment. I think politically that would be to his advantage, assuming the markets don't go haywire. Then you're basically kicking the responsibility to the House of Representatives. And in the start of a presidential cycle, does the Republican Party want to be responsible for that? I don't know, but that's why it's so difficult to forecast this, because there are the legal implications, the markets implications, as Chris Campbell said, but the politics are basically, we don't know. And no one wants to be responsible for this, but everyone wants to get as much out of it as they can, because they think this is a moment where the other side will back down in a way that they might not for a government shutdown over the budget, when that's when, at least historically, the two sides have disagreed on the budget. There's been a government shutdown. The nation's focus turns to those budget procedures, and then one side backs down slightly more than the other and come to a compromise. This seems to be a point, at least among some in Washington, of like, this is the moment where we really get all we want because the other side is willing to back down for us. So that's a long way of saying I don't know what's going to happen because it's never gotten to this point, and there are theories about what could happen that have never been tested because they've never needed to be tested. So I think over the next 2 weeks, at least on the Democratic side, there's going to be more pressure on the president to basically nullify the debt ceiling one way or the other. Whether that works, we just don't know.
Yeah, there's one other, well, there's several other paths that the administration could take, and I literally can't confirm or deny that these paths exist, but one would be what they call payment prioritization, where the Treasury Department would choose to pay certain accounts before others, before the government literally runs out of money. It's the difficult thing is with the debt ceiling is that when the Secretary of Treasury puts a number out there, a date, which she's done in June this time, it's really just a best estimate because the federal government takes in taxes every single day, and it also has to spend money every single day. So that outflow and inflow in their accounts, it's really genuinely impossible to be, on a dollar and cents basis, entirely accurate, because you really don't know what that receipt is, right? I mean, maybe a company gets sold for $1 billion and there's a huge windfall of the U.S. government when the sale happens, right? Or some wealthy person takes a big withdrawal or something like that. So there's lots of different ways, or the federal government gets sued and has to pay a huge settlement to somebody, right? I mean, you really just don't know, and it's really hard to time that out. And so this is that estimate is a good estimate for on the secretary's part. So typically there'll be some money left over before that date, after that date, and so the department could choose to call it prioritized payments. That's really difficult politically speaking, because you'd have to say you're not going to pay military people or Social Security recipients, and you're going to pay the debt, right? So it's politically speaking, it's a very tough time. But the bottom line is this: anything post the deadline is really bad. It's bad for everybody. In these settings, it's funny, we've seen this movie play out so many times in so many different ways, and the result is almost exactly the same. And every president believes it's going to play out differently, but it's at the end of the day, I can't remember a time when the Congress was ever blamed for something in this posture. It's always 600 Pennsylvania. It's always the president, and it's scary at what in this case, because of the consequences are so large. It's scary to watch this happen. But as someone who's been around DC for a very long time, it's you kind of know how the movie's going to play out. What the result's going to be. But really on this one specifically, if we don't find some way to get together, it's not the president that'll lose. It's not the Congress that loses. It's America that loses on this one.
And it's so fascinating. Thank you for explaining all of that. And very closely tied to that is this whole appropriations process that has to get done every year. And the Republicans passed on May 1st a budget resolution that includes significant cuts. They want to go back to 2022 levels. And, the speaker and many in leadership have said, look, this is not the final number. It's just what we're putting out there to start the negotiation. But there's lots of rhetoric flying around the whole appropriation numbers that they're tying to the debt ceiling extension. And so meanwhile, the House Appropriations Committee, their different subcommittees are starting to do markup, what they call markup, where they come up with their bills, even though they don't have that top line agreement, just because they want to get moving on that. So we were hearing that markups were starting as soon as this month. And then finishing up in June, things are already starting to get a little bit delayed because we don't have resolution on the debt ceiling extension. But there's sort of a lot of things that are feeding into this. And I think that it can be very confusing. A lot of the public probably, isn't connecting all those dots or understanding all the implications. And so that also buys them more time to do politics and their rhetoric. So there's a lot of factors, I think, that are coming into this. So my next question on this topic, and then we'll move on to some other topics. What do you expect to happen? I know you both are saying this is the cycle we go through every time, but like, what do you actually think will happen this time around, Chris Campbell?
On approach? On approach specifically, Liz?
With the debt ceiling, like, will they get a deal done in June, or what do you think? How is that going to unfold?
So I really don't right now to do something that would envision the cuts that are going to be required for negotiations. Like I'm asking this way, if we don't see a deal by Wednesday or Thursday this week, we're going to have to do a clean debt ceiling, a short-term extension or breach. Right, those are really the only two ways you can do it, because again, just procedurally speaking, this drives everyone crazy. But there is just some things that have to, the way that the Senate and the House work. So in that scenario, we could be at a technical breach, even though the gears of government are working and moving something. So again, probably the most likely scenario is a very short-term extension.
That probably is a bipartisan vote, right? They're going to have to probably get moderates to support something like that, don't you think?
Look, this is going to gain some out, but like there's two ways to write an extension, because when the government borrows money, there's a process called extraordinary measures that the Treasury Department does a lot. So they effectively what it does, they effectively clear all of the accounts to zero, and they pay everything out, and then they start managing other accounts that are not accounts used to pay bills, like effectively like pension accounts and other things, and those are called extraordinary measures. So it really extends the time the government can pay its obligations. When all of those accounts get drained, then the government runs out of money. That's effectively the X date that we're talking about. When Congress allows the government to come and go in and borrow money again, it can refill all of those accounts. And so it'll borrow all the money necessary to refill all those accounts, and then perhaps then some, which this is the only reason I'm telling you this is because it matters on the way that the House may posture here. But if they just kind of like let the government borrow all that money again, what you're effectively doing is you could be buying 6 months or even 8 months, because then you have the entire time the extraordinary measures for the government to go in and manage those accounts again. And so the House is probably not going to want to do that. In fact, no one's going to want to do that, because really what that happens is we're right in the middle of what I call silly season, which is the presidential election. Passing a debt ceiling at that time would literally be impossible. Literally impossible. It would never happen. So you're going to need a very short time frame, a very short extension here. So probably what Congress will do is pass a clean extension, but disallow government from actually filling up those accounts, and only borrowing is a small amount of money to get through 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is, a week or 2 weeks, whatever it is. And so that's, that would be interesting to watch how they posture there. But I really think it's, we're at a short-term extension. And then my guess is probably some kind of budget, something like we did in 2011, which didn't go so well. But we tried. That's my.
All right, Chris Oates, what's your prediction?
I mean, I think I don't know about the short-term extension, but I think they fudge it with some sort of agreement. It's not the full cuts, but the permitting reform gets in there almost certainly. There's some budget thing, and then there's an extension either to pass the budget cycle so they can do it again, or maybe like to next March, I think I heard. But I mean, I also wouldn't discount the 14th Amendment, because I think that's much more likely then we pass the X date and Biden does nothing. Because I think we're talking about the deal and whether they have some sort of thing, but there's going to get to a point in time where the senior advisors in the White House are going to the president and they're saying, here are all the terrible things that we're expecting to see in the markets next week. Your reelection is sunk. We're going into a recession. Or you stand up and say, this thing that's never been done, but a lot of the legal scholars think we could do it. I'm going to do that, and just try to bluff your way through it. Because I think, again, the debt ceiling is so weird. Other countries don't have it. I think the one other country that does have it is Denmark, and they've never gotten anywhere close to breaching it. So it's not as if this is an integral part of our nation's fabric. This is a weird, antiquated thing that, at some point, policy entrepreneurs realized was a leverage point to achieve their policy agenda. And so it is always possible that happens. So I'm not saying it will happen, but I think that this is a moment where we don't just say, here's how the system works. I think it's where people start to get creative about what they can do outside of the system to achieve their aims, which is a large way of saying I don't know.
Yes, I know. Yes, I'm with you. Okay, really interesting. I did see a question pop up. Is there a point when the debt limit to GDP becomes unsustainable?
It's a brilliant question. The answer is no one has any clue. That our debt is sustainable as long as and until people are willing to buy it or not buy it, right? So our spending process is from my opinion, out of control. Government has a significant spending problem. There's no state in our nation and no family in our nation that can do what the federal government does. Burden, literally now probably 2 generations of Americans prospectively for the debt, but they just continue borrowing. So that problem only gets worse. There's lots of, and this we can get massively into like political challenges here and really fisticuffs on this, but like there's some economists now subscribe that suggest that the U.S. government doesn't matter how much we have in because we're the reserve currency. Again, that's only as good until we're not. And so I think that I think. Prudently speaking, I think that there's a way. We should be able to find ways as a country to be able to pare back, to live with less. I've worked in government a long time, authorizing lots of programs, both in the entitlement side and non-entitlement side. And all I can tell you is I don't remember a time. And I worked for Senator Hatch, who'd been there before his retirement, was there for 46 years. A U.S. senator. He didn't remember a time under which the U.S. government ever got rid of a program. Government's really good at growing programs and starting programs. It's amazingly bad at paring them back and getting rid of programs. We just, eventually we're going to have to come to a time where that happens. And really what's scary to most people, but just is reality. We're literally on a course we're going to find a way, because we're as a nation unable to get to a place where we can start talking honestly to people. But we're very close to a period of time where there's going to be mandatory cuts in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. There's going to be mandatory cuts. It's just going to happen. There's just, there's nothing you can do about it. And so we're getting close. And, I think that prudently speaking, it's better, I think, to be honest with the American people and start talking about these really difficult challenges before, waking up 7 years from now and suggesting that, we just can't afford it, right? And your benefits are going to be cut in half. And it's just, I think that's, it's not honest. And I think that it's, we should be honest with people as we approach these really difficult challenges. And it's better for us to prudently plan now and say we can live without some. Every program's important to lots of people, but there's some important programs that are probably more important than others. And Washington's about leading, and we need leaders in Washington who are willing to make really difficult decisions and try to find ways of prudently getting our country to a place where it's sustainable.
Right. Okay, so let's shift gears. I do see a question here I'm going to ask in a minute, but let's switch gears to Ukraine. And we've got the G7 summit coming up. A lot of recent announcements about a lot more money pouring in. What are your thoughts on Ukraine, how it's impacting our economy? How do you see this playing out? Any thoughts on that? And would love to start with Chris Oates this time.
Yeah, I think there's a few different metrics. I think first, a lot of the money that you hear, $3 billion going to Ukraine, a lot of that is military aid. So in some ways it's stimulative, where buying stuff from ourselves and then sending it to over there. So it's not as if we're just like getting $3 billion in pallets and shipping it over to Ukraine. I think that another thing that is really interesting, the dynamics, is that I saw just today, or I believe at the G7, they're going to shut down Russian natural gas exports on pipelines that Russia has previously throttled, meaning the pipelines into Germany and into Poland. This is part of Europe trying to get as far away from a dependence on Russian natural gas as possible. They were at 40%, I think, just before the invasion. They're now down to 10, and they're basically trying to phase out Russian gas. That's very good for US LNG exporters, who are picking up some of the slack, some also coming from the Gulf. So in that sense, by getting Europe away from Russian energy exports, it's a new market, or a larger market for US exports. But I think in general, I'd say I would really question the impact on the US economy of the war in Ukraine, outside of the wider shocks to like Europe from the energy crisis, where if they can manage that, and if Europe can grow again, I think the amount of money going to Ukraine is not that big of a deal compared to the larger impact of what happens with the global economy if China sees a successful Russian invasion of Ukraine and thinks we're going to do that to Taiwan. Because I think Russia-Ukraine, it's obviously economically important, certainly for the people who are there. But then you hear about China having exercises around the island of Taiwan, and given that 90% of our semiconductor exports come from Taiwan, it's the sort of thing where a small disruption to that trade would have a much larger economic impact. So I don't want to diminish the money going to Ukraine, but it's not that big a deal in terms of the global economy compared to other geopolitical flashpoints that could emerge, especially if Europe continues on its path of getting away from Russian gas dependence.
Chris Campbell, do you have thoughts to add?
No, I mean, other than that, it's like I'm all for standing up for democracy, but it's I mean, it's funny, we turned from one topic to the next, and the very first thing we did was we'll just justify more spending. This is the reason why we're more than $30 trillion in debt, right? So there's always priorities, there's always things to spend money on, right? And it's but it's important, like we have to try to find a way as a country. Now, is this worthy of burdening the generation above, ahead of us? And look, I think defending democracy is certainly a very worthy cause. It's something that's very, very important. And Chris is right. Like, I think that the war in Ukraine has had a hyperinflationary position in Europe. Has certainly destabilized the global economy in many ways, and is certainly additive, I think, probably in the recession we have upcoming. But it's but what would be worse, of course, is it would be a head-to-head conflict with China, which still may be unavoidable. But it's so that's it's certainly a problem. It's certainly a very complicated issue. That's obviously going to be drawn up for some time, and but I'm a huge fan, and I've been a devotee of Ronald Reagan for a long time. I think that's democracy, I think, is worth fighting for, and freedom is worth fighting for. And I think I think that we have to, as a country, have values, and like if we can't rally around democracy, then we're in a lot of trouble. So that's my position.
Yeah. So it just seems like this is just going to be going on for a long time, and we all just have to be ready for that. Related to sort of the economy, things shaping the economy, have you guys been tracking the R&E tax issue, where for the first time ever, an SBIR recipient, so the Small Business Innovation Research Grant recipient, is going to be taxed on 90% of that grant that they receive from the government? So they're getting money from the government to do very important research work, innovation work for this nation, which makes us globally competitive, much superior to other countries when it comes to innovation. And then we're going to charge we're going to make them pay taxes on 90% of that. that they receive from the government. This is a huge issue for the small businesses. I've been doing some lobbying on it, and I was just curious if you guys had comments on that or were tracking that. It has still not been resolved. So we are in the current tax year. People are paying this tax now, or they're trying to get a CPA to help them get out of paying it. But it is the current law, and there's some efforts to try and end it. But it's unlikely to pass now. It would have to be wrapped into an omnibus. So any thoughts on that and sort of the innovation economy?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's small business is the backbone of innovation in our country. They're responsible for almost 80% of new jobs, and certainly a lot of innovation. I mean, actually, most big companies actually buy small companies, and that's gives you how they innovate. So it's certainly an incredibly important aspect of the economy overall. There are many issues perplexing the service nowadays, the Internal Revenue Service nowadays, including hiring about 80,000 new people to be auditors. But I think the challenge we have is real. I think. Look, I mean, let's say it this way: if you are a company that's impacted, I think it certainly would be worthy of your time to get a hold of your representatives, both in the House and Senate, to be able to opine on this. I think it's like, I'm a Republican. I'm not the biggest fan of taxes, but I will say, I mean, like the government should tax, and there's obviously a necessary component of government that requires taxing. But that being said, I think that, as I said before, we spend much more than we collect in taxes, and it doesn't matter if you raise taxes, the government will still spend not much more. So government just has a real big spending problem. But on top of that, I think it's kind of prudently speaking, I think it's, there was a study that was just recently conducted. I no longer live in New York, but I just moved down I now live in Florida, but like just taxes alone, you have to make $300,000 in New York City to take home $100,000. Everyone has their choice to where they live and the jurisdictions of which they live, but we're at a point now where I think taxes are deeply meaningful and deeply impactful to people's lives. And I think people are choosing to live different spots because of the tax burdens that they have. Anyway, I'm all about making sure that cutting red tape and reducing the burden on small businesses, because again, they are the backbone of the U.S. economy.
And I'd say I have no special insight into this particular issue, but this is the sort of thing that I think any senator or representative would be glad to stand up in the well of the House or the Senate and talk about what an outrageous error this is, because it's probably not intentional, I'm guessing, or talk about it at a hearing with someone, and then when it gets repealed as part of some bill, go stand at a press conference like Capitol Hill and say, like, I have saved small businesses, I've saved innovation. I think this is one of those issues that you talk to anyone in the House and the Senate, and you tell them about this, and you say you have the opportunity to be the champion of small business innovation, they will take it. I don't think, I mean, there are some members of the House and Senate that advocate for higher taxes. I don't think anyone would say 90% tax rate on small business grants is at level. So I'm sure that they would be happy to do this. So I'm not going to predict it, but I would not be very surprised if this is one of the first things that is wrapped up in an omnibus bill of the budget in the fall.
Yeah, yep, agreed. I think it's fascinating, though, that no one in Congress really knew about it. It was like we had to do an awful lot of education before they even knew about it. And then a bill was dropped 2 months ago in the Senate, and then just in the past 2 weeks in the House. So we at least now have legislation to end it, but it was very surprising, and an example of how often members, they pass legislation, but they don't have the time to read every single section of a bill, especially an omnibus or some big package. So I think that's an interesting example of that. But
well, I think, Liz,
on,
I just want to follow up on
yeah.
that. I think it's really interesting. And this is something that me coming like as a non-DC person coming into politics and analyzing it, I think we often forget that the people on Capitol Hill are people with limited hours in the day, and they can't know about everything immediately. And there was a really interesting report a couple of weeks ago by an independent journalist site in New York, Talking Points Memo, where one of the reporters went up to Capitol Hill, and I believe it was about the Dianne Feinstein issue, where she's not on judiciary, so judiciary committee couldn't do the certain things. And she asked members of various offices on the judiciary committee, would you consider this thing, which I think was a proxy vote, to like, there's a precedent in this. And most of the people she talked to said, oh, I'm not aware of that. And just because, you know, a reporter or a lobbyist or an analyst who's dived deep on an issue knows about something doesn't mean that someone dealing with a dozen different things in a day does know that. So I think we often might think that members of Capitol Hill don't care, but sometimes it's just they're not aware of an issue. And so, yeah, I think what you had to do with education is a crucial part of the process of just letting them know there's a problem out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So 2 other topics I want to get to. So one, what are your comments on the strength of the economy now, where you see it going, inflation, all kinds of things? Like, what's your prediction, how we're going to finish out the year? And then I want to chat a little bit about elections and then do some questions. So the economy, how would we sum up the economy now? Where do we see it going? And Chris Campbell, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I've been predicting a recession the back half of this year, which I think we're probably going to be, we'll come close. At least to be hopefully being spot on. I think unfortunately, I think the prediction is probably going to be right. We still see inflation sticky in some key components as well. I'll tell you, if we breach the debt ceiling, recession is going to be we could probably be actually maybe looking at depression. So like I think that the reality is that we're likely going to be and it pains me to say this, but we're likely to start seeing a stagflationary environment at the back half of this year. Last time we saw that was in the 1970s. They can be very, very sticky. Can not to scare everyone, but that was, chronic unemployment. That's, years of not being able to find a job, that kind of stuff. It's really bad. We're already seeing record lines for food for those who are on the lower end of the earning scale across the country, and record homelessness in our country. So that's, it's likely going to be, it will become precipitated, and we'll start seeing an increase in those challenges, which is going to be a really significantly large socioeconomic challenge throughout the country, and will certainly be a political challenge going into 24. So that's where we're now forecasting that back half of this year. The one really kind of bright light in all of this is that there is more than $1 trillion of capital. I advise a lot of private equity and venture capital funds. There's just a tremendous amount of private capital out there, institutional capital out there, family office capital out there, ready and waiting to be deployed. But that won't be deployed until private companies do what we call revalue. So their valuations come down, because kind of geek speak in Wall Street, no one wants to be the last dollar in before a down round. And so no one wants to put, a dollar in when that dollar could be worth 50 cents tomorrow. So they're going to want that revaluation to happen. But once that happens, I think recession, certainly stagflation, would give certainly a justifiable reason across the board to revalue those private companies. But when that value comes down, I think there'll be a significant amount of activity, a lot of merger acquisition activity by institutions and families and others that have all this capital on the sidelines. And that churn will help companies start growing again and hiring again, all that kind of stuff. So likely we probably see that in the kind of midway through next year. And so that's, really the bright light. So I'm really hopeful that will kind of truncate the really difficult time in the economy and give that kind of buoy that would happen, and I think will happen once institutional money comes in and starts buying companies again. The thing that compounds that is that, of course, is that interest rates are going to remain high for some time, and so usually a lot of these deals are they're put a lot of debt in that structure. So we probably have to see a move toward equity, which will probably be justified because of the new valuations for companies. So that's likely what's our forecast. I'm sticking to it. I'm excited. Again, I think we're gonna go through some tough times, no question. Over the next 12 to 18 months are gonna be very tough times. But I think in the back half of those difficult times, could we really be, we could see a significant new amount of activity in the economy, which will lead new innovation and new industries that perhaps we can't even think of today.
Chris Oates?
The only thing I'll add to that, because I don't forecast GDP numbers, is what is going to happen as if it looks like the Fed is done raising interest rates, at least for a while, because there's been a significant amount of activity that was basically frozen. Housing market is a good example. People didn't want to sell as mortgage rates were rising. People didn't want to necessarily, because they would have to revalue. So I think we kind of have some sections of the economy unlock, because while they were waiting for the rate rises to end, or maybe they were concerned about it, they say, okay, well, this is the interest rate environment for the foreseeable future or less. I'm willing to invest or buy a house or sell my house. So I think that's going to be interesting. The one other thing is just whether or not, and this is a much longer speculative thing, whether or not we start to reevaluate the potential of the economy, because COVID basically accelerated retirements of baby boomers. Basically got them out of the job market, because many said, well, I don't want to be working here remotely for another year. I'm close to retirement anyway, I'll retire. Do we basically see that the US demographic picture in terms of its employment went ahead, say 4 years rather than the 1 year from 2020 to 2021? And does that start to change people's forecasts? So that's a more speculative thing. But I think if the Fed stops raising interest rates and we start to say this is the new normal, more activity in terms of the research and academia, we'll start to put that out, and we'll get a better sense of like where we as an economy stand after the volatility, let's say, of the past few years.
Okay. Elections. What do we think about the elections? Trump, DeSantis, thoughts on how things are shaping up? Interestingly, I was looking at the Senate rundown, and there's 5 states. Well, there's 4 states that have 1D, 1R, a 5th state with an independent and an R, who caucuses with the Democrats, so effectively Democrat. All 5 of those states are up. So it's really interesting to see sort of what's happening and how people are voting. What do you guys think? What comments do you have about the elections? You can talk about presidential, Senate, whatever, but just would love to hear your thoughts on that. Chris Campbell, if you want to start.
Yeah, so I think how do I say this? I'm personally in the camp where I find it deeply disturbing that the best we can do is perhaps a Trump versus Biden again. It makes me very sad as an American to see that as our choices. I really hope that perhaps we can look beyond both of them and try to find a path to get to a different path prospectively. That being said, I think that as I've told many of my Democratic friends, many of them use names you would know, I think the only way to breathe life back into the former president's campaign would be to indict him. I think Democrats have been very successful in doing that. I think that and candidly, we may be on a path to see him reelected because of that. So I think, I think there'll be a wide path and many selections on the Republican side. And there'll be a really robust debate. We're still early. We'll see how it all goes. But I think, I guess we're going to find out where the American people are. The former president certainly has a strong grip on a near majority of the Republican Party. And so I think it's going to be very, very difficult to beat. I think I was proven wrong to the last election. The last election, I think, is an outlier in this regard. American people almost always vote pocketbook issues first and every other issue second. If my forecast is right and on the economy and my colleagues is right, we're likely going to be in a challenged economics position for American families in next November. If that's the case, I believe that the worst thing you can be in that environment is an incumbent. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, people are going to be very angry at the people in charge. So I think kind of across the board, if we're in a recession or in stagflation approximating November of next year, I think this is going to be a really difficult time to be an incumbent seeking re-election. So that would mean that likely a change in the Senate, perhaps even a change in the House back to Democrats, and a change in the executive branches. It would be my forecast, assuming my economic predictions come true.
And I'll say, barring economic predictions, my baseline forecast would be that Democrats win back the House because it's very close and they lost a lot of seats in New York that we expect them to pick up in 2024. The Senate Democrats are almost certainly going to lose a seat. We don't know how many seats, but it does seem like West Virginia is lost. Montana could be lost, Ohio as well, and maybe Arizona. In a bad year, I think they lose all 4 of them. And there's one that I think they can pick up, but it's escaping me at the moment. But I think a best case scenario for Democrats is they win the House, the Senate is at 50-50, and they retain the White House. Now, I think when it comes to the presidential election, there's 2 questions you have to ask. One is, does Trump win the Republican nomination? And in doing so, does he hurt his chances for the general? Because I think, yes, indictments will help him in the Republican nomination, given that it puts more attention on him. And he's had this, crazy skill in basically getting the rest of the party to come to his defense on things that they could be attacking him for. And you saw Ron DeSantis slightly attack him for the hush money case, and then immediately kind of backtracked and said, I won't even, extradite him, which is not really a thing. And so I think until Republican challengers actually attack Donald Trump in the way that Chris Christie is like hinting that he would do if you were a candidate, I think, yes, he is likely to win that. But the very things that make him popular with the Republican base are things that make him unpopular with the general electorate. So while I don't know what that means for the general election, I think you would likely go into it with a Republican candidate that is unpopular. And then the question is he less unpopular than the Democratic candidate? So it's too early to tell. Certainly the economy is going to play a huge role. But I think right now, if I had to be the campaign manager of one side, I'd be the campaign manager for Biden. If, I was hoping to get a job in 2025 in Washington.
All right, that is helpful. We did get a question posted about the Farm Bill and rural development, healthcare. I don't know if you guys have been tracking the Farm Bill that's up this year, have any comments on that. I will say one item to note is that Chair Stabenow is retiring, so she really does want to get this done. It's her legacy. So I think there's a lot of movement to get it done. Generally, D's and R's can work together on this bill, but would love to hear any thoughts that you guys have on it. Whoever would like to go first.
This is not something I'm tracking very closely, so I don't really have kind of an inside scoop that can be very helpful. I'm sorry.
And I just say that, again, from the political perspective, right, they want to give a win to the Michigan senator because that seat is going to be up in 2024. And they definitely want to help Democrats in the Senate. Definitely want to help Tester in Montana. So I would expect there's a lot of bipartisan support for this. I don't know the contours, but I think just getting it done in a reasonable manner would be, there's support for it.
Yeah, I agree. I think Farm Bill will get done, and then PAPA is the other one around preparedness and response. That is also up, and they've started to collect ideas to put together legislation on that. And I know Chairman Brown, also Ohio Senator, has been putting together a housing package. So he wants to address some housing issues. So there are some other efforts sort of outside the funding debates that we're hearing all about. But I think that everything kind of falls in line after the funding debates are resolved. So we need the debt ceiling extension and some kind of deal on top line numbers for FY24 appropriations, I think, before we can get to these other legislative pieces. Everything is sort of hinging on that. So interesting times. Again, another great discussion with my colleagues here. I'm gonna ask you a final challenging question. So if you had to sum up how we're going to close out the year in a word or two, a couple words, what would those words be? How would you sum up where we're going to be at the end of this year? Chris Oates.
All eyes on the presidential election.
One word probably be uncertainty. Probably a great amount of it. It's going to be really bumpy next year and a half.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say it's going to be a rough ride and it will kick off election season. So I'm going to agree with both of you. And with that, we are done. Thank you all for dialing in. Thank you both, Chris and Chris. You're awesome. This is always such a fascinating discussion. Folks, stay tuned. We do this on a quarterly basis. So we look forward to seeing you in 3 months. Thanks so much and have a great week. Bye.